So I'm just going to jump around a bit throughout the book and try and give you a sense of the whole thing, even though I think maybe most of you already know it. And I think the place to begin is with its date of birth, which I think most books don't have. This one does. January 1st, 1997, the day I first arrived in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, one of 7 new states to emerge from the former Yugoslavia. At that time, it was roughly, actually, I forgot my little PowerPoint presentation, heavens. Can I manage to get it on? Yeah. There we go. Have to, it's a lovely cover by our art director, Pam Glavin, and UMass Press, so, I'll have to give you something to look at. So anyway, I was telling you about how this book got started. So January 1st, 1997 was the first day I set foot in Sarajevo. At that time, it was about a year after the end of the Bosnian War, and if it wasn't for my sister, I might have never set foot there. My wife and I, Anna, were in Italy at her family home. My sister Peggy had moved from her job in Zagreb, working for the UN at the end of the war, to begin work in Sarajevo, where she'd live for the next 3 years. She spent that Christmas with us, and afterwards it seemed natural enough for her to go, for me to go back with her for a visit. Family solidarity. Since then, I've just kept going. For anybody who's been there in recent years, and even more so, I imagine for those who were there during the war, I won't need to explain why. A few days after September 11th, 2001, a reporter on National Public Radio did an interview with Fran Lebowitz. Best known for her ironic commentaries on daily life in the United States, Lebowitz was not perhaps the obvious choice for an interview, yet for many she's the quintessential New Yorker, and her response to the horror of the past few days must have seemed relevant for that reason alone. Thinking back, I wonder whether Leibowitz's wit might have been what the NPR reporter was seeking out. Somehow, I doubt it. Unlike Sarajevo, America was relatively slow in defending itself with humor. As I recall, the parody newspaper, The Onion, was the first to do so. Some weeks later, it reported that the White House was urging Al-Qaeda to form a country so we could more easily attack them. Osamaland, they suggested, might be its name. Anyway, in this interview, I found one comment by Leibowitz particularly striking and strangely moving. The reporter inquired what, as a writer, a public figure, and noted New Yorker, Leibowitz herself had been doing since the attack. She responded by refusing the basis for his question. Writers, she replied, are luxury items. In such moments, many people are essential for the services that they alone provide. One imagines a list including police, firemen, surgeons, construction workers, even journalists. Though help and support from everyone on some level might also be needed, the skills of the various professions are not equally useful. And as for writers, well, writers are luxury items. We could, of course, dispute this point. Few, in fact, would be better placed to argue with Leibowitz than Sarajevans, the residents of a city that resisted 3.5 years of barbarism, in no small part through their cultural institutions and creative arts. What this remark brought to mind for me, however, immediately and intimately, was a feeling that literature professors may also be mere frosting. In that instant, I recalled a sentiment I'd had that first week in January 1997. Walking around the hillside neighborhoods of Sarajevo, I saw people everywhere, cleaning up, rebuilding, putting their lives back together. At that moment, a life with books rather than bricks just didn't seem particularly well spent. The moral to this story is simple. For me, a brief comment by a quintessential New Yorker a few days after 9/11 served to transport me to another place on the globe, demonstrating just how close Sarajevo and New York and any other two spots on the globe potentially are. When it comes to war stories, in short, the stakes are high. After all, in a democracy, we're each responsible for the policy decisions taken on our behalf. If, despite the sneers of certain historians and sociologists, we treat historical representation and even history itself as a text, we then begin to ask certain kinds of questions, such as who is speaking, who is the audience, and what are the rules for this kind of talk. Knowing what happened and why is certainly a worthy goal, yet a practical first step, and the one that's emphasized in this book, is to learn the language through which such history is spoken. Understanding how war stories are told may be necessary in order to arm ourselves against them. In today's world, our screens burgeon daily with scenes from countless conflicts across the globe, commanding our attention, asking for our endorsement, forcing us to choose sides. What each of us needs, preparation for citizenship in this world, is fluency in the diverse forms of representation: journalism, photography, fiction, memoir, comics, cinema, that bring such wars to us. So that's what I focus on in the book. I'll skip a bit to what I generally call the thesis chapter. And I'll give you another picture to look at too. So the thinking behind this chapter began in some sense in early March 1999, after the refugee crisis in Kosovo had begun, and when the NATO bombing campaign was only days away. One evening after classes, I attended a teach-in on the crisis. At that event, attended by about 100 students and professors, a sociologist, Peter Rose, was the first to speak. He began by showing us a collection of news photos, which he had accumulated from a variety of conflicts over the past decades. Each photo portrayed a nearly identical image, a mother and her child, invariably in the midst of one desolation or another. Rose explained, with no trace of irony, that within human rights organizations, this image is commonly referred to as the Madonna of the refugees. His point was not, as mine will be here, to describe and reflect on the constraints and presuppositions within our collective imagination which caused this image to be generated time and time again. Then the case was more simple. In March 1999, history seemed to be repeating itself, and Professor Rose wanted us to think about this woman with her child, to imagine ourselves in her place, and to remember her face the next time events in the world brought it to our attention. And indeed, that time was now. As if my colleague had predicted it, the very next cover of Time magazine portrayed a Kosovar Albanian woman wearing a headscarf and breastfeeding her child while carrying it through a crowd of other displaced Kosovars. Now, Cap's and boldface question on this cover does seem bold. Was Time lobbying for military intervention? By 1999, many published accounts of the earlier war in Bosnia had claimed that journalism was instrumental in bringing the conflict to an end. The notion of an activist press is familiar, of course, at least since the U.S. war in Vietnam. Coverage has often been said to set the terms of public opinion. Politicians in Western democracies are seen as responding to the sentiments of their various publics. The right pictures are worth, as it were, 1,000 divisions. I won't speculate here about whether such claims for the power of the press are true. Many articles and a few books as well have already begun to investigate this issue. I do suspect, however, that any straightforward narrative of journalistic triumph is far too simple. Whatever the case, even before we examine the effects of war coverage, we would do well to analyze the coverage itself. And the place to begin, as far as I'm concerned, is with a quotation from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's discourse on inequality. In that influential essay, Rousseau imagined an onlooker who witnesses and is unable to aid a mother and child being attacked by a savage beast. And this is Rousseau. the tragic image of an imprisoned man who sees through his window a wild beast tearing a child from its mother's arms, breaking its frail limbs with murderous teeth and clawing its quivering entrails. What horrible agitation seizes him as he watches the scene, which does not concern him personally? What agitation he suffers from being powerless to help the fainting mother and the dying child. For the French philosophe, the spectacle he depicted naturally and necessarily displays the expression of sympathy, a sentiment he believed so widespread that it isn't even species-specific. From his comments, however, readers today may suspect that Rousseau found tragedy as much in the anguish and agitation it produces as in the fate it describes to the mother and child. I'll jump forward again. Actually, this is to the final chapter. It's one of the 3 books I talk about there. And here's the cover. Obviously, the title of this book is meant to make you stop and take notice. It's called Shoot an Iraqi. The cover photo, as you see, is black and white, one shoulder and half the chest of a man wearing a black jacket and keffiyeh. His body tilted to the right side of the page, head nearly outside the frame, only a bit of dark hair. Covering the cheek, ear, neck, and shoulder is a circular yellow splatter. Similar but smaller blotches of yellow dot the top edge of the cover and its bottom left corner. The book's subtitle, as you can see, is Art, Life, and Resistance Under the Gun. The authors are Wafa Bilal and Carrie Lederson. Wafa Bilal's an Iraqi artist who came to the United States as a refugee after the 1991 Iraq War. Carrie Lederson is a journalist and author who reports for the Washington Post. Shoot an Iraqi tells Bilal's life story in the first person to document a work of performance art staged in the spring of 2007. The book's first paragraph offers a concise summary. On May 4th, 2007, I entered Flat File Galleries in Chicago for a project called Domestic Tension, a live art installation. For 1 month, I would live in a makeshift room set up in the gallery, going about my daily routine with a robotically controlled paintball gun aimed at me, which people could shoot live and over the internet 24 hours a day. When the month ended, more than 65,000 shots had been fired at Bilal by people from over 136 countries. In my war stories class, as we read Shoot an Iraqi together, I asked the students to apply an idea from the philosopher Jonathan Glover. His idea in this book called Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century is that somehow you can adjust societies, their kind of social rigging, in order to get better results. One of the ways he tries to demonstrate that is through a problem called the prisoner's dilemma, which some of you may know about, that I won't get into more here. Anyway, like the prisoner's dilemma, Bilal's performance piece constructs an artificial system, one that seems to encourage some behaviors and discourage others. If humanity is the goal, do the choices of Bilal and his team, the choices they make in shaping domestic tension, increase or decrease it? As is true of all performance, these choices were only in part made before the work opened. Any interactive medium demands constant attention and flexible responses to ever-changing conditions, an open hand as well as a fixed sense of purpose. The paintball project, which relied on participation from its audience, was a particularly dynamic form of art installation. As a result, it also invited a host of problems that no design and no designer, however creative, could have predicted. The space used by the exhibition measured 32 feet by 15 feet. It resembled a well-furnished prison cell or perhaps a college dorm room. Bed, desk, computer, lamp, and coffee table. There was also an unused exercise bike. several plexiglass screens or shields, a mock door frame, and of course the robotically controlled paintball gun at the threshold of Bilal's living space. A small viewing area for visitors and a computer from which they could fire the gun were provided as well. The webcam interface for the project was left intentionally bare. Its image was a grainy black and white streamed without sound. Each day, Bilal also recorded video, edited it down, and posted it on YouTube. In addition, the website had a chat room where shooters and watchers alike could interact with the artist, and a software program recorded the IP address and geographical location of each computer that operated the gun. Bilal spent the entire month in the building, although he did occasionally leave his cell to nap, shower, use the bathroom, get food, or give media interviews. Aside from those brief respites, he comments, I spent the majority of my time in the range of the gun as an available target. He wore a paintball vest and goggles throughout the exhibit, along with his trademark keffiyeh. So I'll cut actually to the end of the book, of the project, just to give something that's a little less dark for a change. As the month-long paintball project ended, a truly great spontaneous eruption of hope took shape in both behavior and language. With only a few days left in the project, during a dark hour in which the shooting once again reached an unbearably high frequency, a former art student and watcher found a way out. She realized that the project's website controls could be used not just to target Wafa, but also to protect him. By sending repeated commands to turn the gun to the left, she managed to block the shooters, and could do so as long as her clicks outnumbered theirs. She then organized others, and out of the watchers and shooters, a group of protectors was formed. They called themselves the Virtual Human Shield. Working together, they set up shifts and managed to shelter Wafa for the duration of the project. Rousseau's imprisoned man pushes at last on the door, only to find it had been unlocked all along. So the other two books I talk about in this last chapter are J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians and a book by David Albahari called Guts and Meyer. And these three books, I think, are similar in that each of the stories they tell refuse a fixed disposition of roles, one that found its modern form some 3 centuries ago. Like Coetzee's magistrate or Al-Bahari's school teacher, Wafa Bilal's performance piece moves the artist through each of the positions that sentimental forms of representation freeze in place. Victim, aggressor, observer. The artist as target, the objectification and suffering of his body and mind are where he chooses to place himself, but he also loads the gun and even creates the mechanism that allows it to be aimed. Finally, as any artist must, he also stands outside the work, in front of its dynamic, shifting scene, making those choices which in part determine what we see. For the 21st century, or at least for now, such narratives, I think, offer us a pretty good rule of thumb. War stories today should be judged on whether and to what extent they deny us the easy way out and make it impossible for us to see the positions of victim, aggressor, and observer as immutable, assigned in advance. Coetzee's magistrate understands that his own history is unlikely to allow him to crack the code of those whose lives and languages his kind have so long failed to recognize. But that doesn't stop him from trying, and he may perhaps be bettered by the attempt. Al-Bahari's school teacher fails to unlock the identity of 2 men who remain resistantly ordinary and unspeakably evil. and yet he may have managed to sow the seeds of memory and thus prevent the weeds of forgetting from growing. For a month in the spring of 2007, Wafa Bilal's lifelong project of bringing war stories home held up the shield of Perseus and allowed us to see the lived experience, the material meaning of war. Medusa, as we know, lives on.